This is the Iron Sharpens Iron Movement, sharing insights into the power of people-centric leading.
Hi, this is Jim, and today we welcome to our tribe an advisor to Fortune 500 companies and a professor at the Ross School of Business at the University of Michigan. He has simultaneously creative and pragmatic approach to making innovation happen, has led clients and colleagues to dub him the Dean of Innovation. It's time to rethink the way that we make innovation happen. So let's go to school. This is Jeff DeGraff. Iron Sharpens Iron Movement is brought to you by N2 Growth, a leader in executive search, leadership development, and talent management. We find and develop the world's best leaders. Learn more about our practice by visiting us at n2growth.com or click on the link in the show notes of this podcast. Jeff, welcome to the Iron Sharpens Iron Tribe. I am thrilled to have you here, and I tell you what, it's an honor to talk to someone when they come with the title Dean of Innovation. Welcome to the tribe.
Jim, thanks for having me on.
Jeff, I tell you, one of the things that I'm most excited about is, you've just come out with this brand new book called The Creative Mindset, and I know we're going to dive deep into that. But you've got a pretty long legacy of being one of these people that really bring innovation to the forefront. So my first one's a simple one, and then we're going to dive deeper. But how did you get, when I was doing all the research on you, when I was really looking into you, I always wondered to myself, if I was in Jeff's shoes, how did I get to that point to say, I can make things better? I can think of things differently, because most people grow up in the let's just go along to get along kind of mindset. What broke you out of that so early in your career?
Well, because I was a terrible student growing up. I got to college as an athlete and stayed in college as a Teamster. I grew up in a HUD house, and I was a terrible student. And I used to cut classes, and I would go to the public library, sit up side down in a beanbag chair and read the Encyclopedia Britannica. Everybody was convinced I was an idiot. But I'm the first year, because of Title IX, that we had to take the SAT. I took it late. Turned out I wasn't an idiot. So then I got to go to college, and all of a sudden, the way that I thought all the way up to about 18, which was weird and unorthodox and creative, all of a sudden it caught. And somewhere between, I graduated real early. I did my PhD in 2 years and won all these awards. So I went from being, look at that weird kid, to, oh, he might know a thing. And then I did the weirdest thing ever. I turned down an Ivy League position, and I went to work for a man with a $20 million pizza company. And 5 years and billions of dollars later, I sold it to Mitt Romney. It was Domino's Pizza. So I understood that my brain was weird, and I just followed it, because you can't be anybody but who you are.
Oh, amen to that. Amen to that. Do you think, so would you consider yourself, a left brain thinker, right brain thinker, you're just ultra creative and you're always curious? What do you think of yourself when you come to being a thinker?
I don't think it's anything that specific. I just think it's sort of like, what you realize is how you make sense of the world. And how I make sense of the world is I have to see the whole picture. And the other thing that's very, I think, different about me is I notice that when I meet people like me, there's a part to it that's really funny. And that is that we're liars. Now I don't mean this in the demonstrative term. I mean, when somebody asks you how you thought of it, you don't tell them the truth, which is, well, I heard this soundtrack in my head, and then I was walking down the road and I was looking at a tree, and then I remembered this, I was golfing with this friend, and then
Right.
and then it goes into your logical brain, because I have a lot of education, I'm extremely logical, and then it goes into, well, how would that work? And why does that work like that? And when you start talking to people who do things like this, there seems to be this dialogue between these two parts of yourself.
How do you control it though? So I do, quite a bit of executive coaching. And so when I have somebody that's with a high curiosity, highly inquisitive, always, chasing the Simon Sinek why kind of thing.
Yep.
One of the things is I watch for as I'm coaching through them and kind of exploring deeper in is how far to the right to that red line are they on that curiosity gauge? And it can become dangerous to a point, almost paralyzing, because they're never satisfied with how something is solved or how to get there. How do you control it, or do you not? Is your argument like, don't control it. Unleash it. Let it
No,
go.
I think you have to control it, but I like what you're saying a lot, which is I think that creative people, and I think most people are creative, walk down a lot of roads a long way. But I think the other part is there's a lot of creative people who've never developed any task discipline. So they don't
Huh.
write, so they can't get the book written. They can't paint the painting. So there's a part that you have to say, there's probably more road to go down here, but that's the next book or that's the next project. So I certainly fit the profile of the serial ideaholic, but I also have, and I think it's maybe because of the way I was raised, I have this extreme discipline, which I notice some people, creative people, don't have, which is when it's time to make money or build the business or write the book or whatever it is, you got to buckle down.
Yep. Yeah. And in my experience of observing that, because I would say I am not overly curious, I'm almost to the other way. I'm a very factual, to the point. I prefer PowerPoint bullets and I just want this,
Yep.
and make those kind of decisions, right brain thinking kind of thing. It is interesting that sense of discipline is really that trigger point. Do you have it or not? Can you control it or not? And how do you reel it in? There's no doubt. It's interesting. Do you find that it is through your experience or is it through your passion that you not only kind of unleash this goodness that you have within yourself, but how do you turn that into organizational design? You were successful working with Domino's early in your career. Was that kind of that pivotal moment in your life that said, I can do this more for just myself, but the organization also?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think there's two parts to it, right? I'm an old Jesuit, right? So the whole notion of what are you leaving here is kind of ingrained from sort of day one, right?
Love it.
In your brain. This is who you're supposed to be. But I got to tell, I put it to you in a little different way. I think there's two things that people get wrong. Young people are always asking me, or they're always coming saying, "I want to tell you what I want to do." And I'm actually very unpopular with my answer because I say, I don't care what you want to do. You could, there's all these people who are on, who are on tryouts for American Idol who caterwaul or like, like a screeching owl. And nobody loved them enough to say you can't sing, right? I think the more important question is, what are you designed to do? So what are your natural gifts? What is your experience? What's your education? What are you designed to do? Because that's what you should be doing. And then the second thing is you'll know it because the world will give you energy when you're doing that. It will say, this is great. And it will also take your energy if it's not that. They'll just say, this is not what you're supposed to be doing right now. So I know it sounds a little new agey, but it's not. I want people to really think that they have gifts, but they're not the same gifts. And it's not just capricious. You don't just get to decide.
Yeah. Wow. I'm sitting here with a huge smile on my face because, Jeff, before we hit record, we're kind of in our green room, just talking. And one of the things that I had said to you was, I had a career in the Air Force. I had spent 30 years there. And something that I tell everybody, I never worked a day in my life when I was in the Air Force because it was what I was meant to do. It was the thing that was my calling. It was that energy pull that you just talked about. And what a grateful opportunity to be one of those people. And I'm talking about myself right now, but to be one of those people that found it, that found their calling. Do you feel you're a bit of a preacher sometimes, in a good way, trying to get to the top of that mountain and preaching to tell people, don't be afraid to go find that passion, to unleash yourself where you really belong?
No, I'm the opposite. But people
Huh?
come, they find me. They find me. And I always tell them this because what happens at this point in my life is everybody goes, how, because I have these innovatrium labs and I write books and I teach college and I have this consulting, right? So they're saying, well, how do I do that? And my response is, well, first of all, there is no job for you. You have to create your job. If you're really, it's got to be custom. So you have to build a portfolio life and you have to decide that you're not going to be limited in your portfolio. So I always tell them, yeah, you can have it all, but it's hard. You can't have it all at once. And it's not about throwing a punch. It's about taking a punch. Are you willing to do the things that are required? So what happens is a lot of people come and see me, but it only sticks with a certain percentage of them. because they are on the path, because they're willing to go through the trials and tribulations of building a portfolio life.
Yep. Yeah, it's ironic that in almost any industry, in any profession, you see a lot of, like you call them posers, right? They pose to try to be this way. They act like they want to be this way.
Absolutely.
But the minute they hit a roadblock, they're just gone.
And incidentally, I have huge issues with this. In fact, this is where things don't go well with me, because I wish I had more tolerance for posers. I just don't. You're not on the path. You're not trying to create something better and new for everybody. I wish you well, but that's not for me.
I give my son that advice too. He's in the Air Force now, and as a young lieutenant intel officer. And one of the things that I tell him is, like, don't get wrapped up around the 80% of people that just create white noise. They're posers, whatever you want to kind of label them as a little bit. It's those 20%ers that I count my son in when I talk to him. I'm like, it's the 20% people that have that focus, have that passion, have that drive to be the best at what they do, and for the right reasons and for that right kind of motivation. And I said, just worry about yourself when it comes to that, because you have that. Everybody else is going to just kind of fall by the wayside, because there's so many people that when the things get hard, they just fall by the wayside. They never decide to go over the hurdle.
It's great advice. It's great advice, and it's hard advice for young people to hear that now.
Yeah.
Where, I'm good at everything. I'm like, no, you're not. And I'm going to help you be good at what you want to be good at. But I just think that's a really important message of trade craft takes time to master. It's a see one, do one, teach one. And I was so lucky when I was young. I got to be the graduate student assistant to Rudolf Arnheim, the guy who creates, the whole creativity field in the 1920s. I'm the end of sort of that line. I was brought to Michigan by Bob Quinn and C.K. Prahlad. Tom Monahan took good care of me in building dominoes. So I got to be around people who were just better than I was. And it reminded me of wrestling in high school. If you're going to be a really good wrestler, for the first three years in high school, people are beating on you every day.
True.
Eventually, you learn a few skills along the way.
With some bumps and bruises.
Yes.
That's right. Yeah. It's that's Jeff. It's funny. It's one of the reasons I chose the title of this podcast. I just love the meaning of iron sharpens iron. A sword does not become sharp on its own. It takes that grinding and that hard work, and others doing something to it, that kind of that forging and forcing and all of that. And it's conversations like this that I think the audience starts to dig on, because, just like you have these great mentors coming up, and, they coached you to who you were, to be your own person, but you were forged by taking little bits and pieces from all of those experiences that you had in the past.
Yes, absolutely. And it's all part of the reason, a lot of my work, anybody's familiar with my work, they've seen the models and all this. I'm sure they probably don't know that that's my work, but, I'm huge on the idea of diversity. And why? Because it produces constructive conflict. And constructive conflict is what drives creativity. It's what drives innovation. So if you look at the 21 places in this country that produce almost all the intellectual property, all the patents, what you're going to notice is people are different. They have different ideas. They come from different places. They have different skills, different belief systems. They eat different food. So I live in this little town called Ann Arbor. It's really small. I live in a 100,000 person town, right? But if you look at venture capital per person or things like that, I live in one of the shining lights of innovation in this country, maybe in the world, particularly given what's going on with COVID. So the notion is, it's not about people are just smart. Smart is necessary, but not sufficient, right? You need way more than smart. You need to be around people who say, I don't think that's a very good idea. So you get to a hybrid. So I'm not talking about negative conflict. I'm talking about positive tensions. And this is why it's important that we have to have that conversation. I get very worried about trigger words. And don't get me wrong, don't say it's not about prejudice. You can't be prejudiced. That's the opposite.
Right.
But we have to be able to have the conversation. We have to be in a space where we can talk about this thing, because otherwise we're not going to get to the better way, the third way, the new way.
It's so interesting. The first time that I heard you bring this about innovation needs diversity to thrive is I actually read your speech. I actually watched the YouTube of it during the 2018 Air Force Symposium. And it was interesting about how you were challenging, the military to think differently and to innovate. The military is just a big old machine that's chugging along, and it's very hard to kind of turn it in a different direction because of how hierarchical and bureaucratic it is. And thankfully, that's changing for sure. But it's interesting. You always talk about diversity from leadership perspectives for all different kinds of ways, and even saying diversity means the way that people think differently, and exactly how you defined it. And you bring that into the round table of a leadership discussion, but it's you bringing to the point that innovation happens because of a diverse crowd, I think is the new way to think of it for sure.
Well, think about this. We have peer adversaries for the first time since the Cold War. Our peer adversaries are highly aligned. They're like General Motors was in the 70s, Tencent and Baidu and Giant Ant, and all that's vertically integrated. Well, just like a big company, the way in which you deal with that is diversification. You spread out, you create conundrums, right? Just like you do with small companies attacking big companies. So the notion is our great strength is our diversity. Think about this for a minute. I always say innovation, the history of innovation in America is the history of immigration. And if you don't believe that, this year we had 6 Nobel Prize winners in the United States. All 6 were not born here, right? This is our history.
I did not know that. Awesome.
This is our history.
Yeah.
This is who we are, and it's part of and it's not polite company a lot of times. A lot of times there's some pushing and shoving, but hopefully not destructive, trying to get to the next place.
So, everybody's using COVID as kind of the template of, things have changed very quickly. And, you had many organizations, big or small, that always thought of themselves as innovative, right? Some people even have it in their branding that they're innovative and all of that. But you kind of, in the creative mindset, the new book, you kind of really challenge us that it's time to even rethink how you make innovation happen.
Absolutely.
Right? What is your secret sauce to how you've changed this, really?
Well, I'm going to come at this from left field for a couple of reasons. I grew up in an America that had a sense of destiny. There was that you could come out of a neighborhood like my neighborhood and you could be somebody. I'm worried that innovation has become something for only the top business schools to make another $1 billion, or it's kind of new age thinking. Bothers me, right? That bothers me. I want to use the example you just gave, and then we'll jump into the book in a second, because I think it's a perfect teaching point. Think about COVID, and I don't care what side of the political spectrum you're on. Our government, from top to bottom, failed completely. It was by any objective measure, right? We're compared to India, Mexico, and Brazil. This is a disaster. But I want you to think about something that happened during that same period of time, right? We had 595 creativity clusters emerge to enter phase 1 drug trials, right? Then we had 116 made it to phase 2. We got 6 in phase 3. It looks like we'll have 16 to 12 by the time we're done. We're going to have 5 or 6 different ways to solve this problem by, let's say, January, February timeline. Don't believe all the politicians. It's nonsense. I don't care who they are. But the notion is, in this organic way, we have rediscovered something that I think we forgot, which is how we organically, through diversity, through trial and error, how we come to this. And it starts with a mindset. And the mindset really has a couple things that are important about this. So the first is, when people, in the book, I start out by saying there's these 8 things that you have to have a creative mindset. And what I've really done here, Jim, I've really taken real research and I boiled it down into kind of every person language, kind of like, I'm a little glib with it. But things like this, like look for incongruities. Look for the thing that doesn't go with the other thing, right? I think that's a really good thing that creative people do. And when you start doing that, you'll start questioning what you're hearing from whatever your political party is or whatever your belief system is, because the people who are on your social media who like what you do aren't very helpful anyway. They just are reinforcing all the crap and nonsense that you believe, right? So start out by looking for the loyal opposition and look for anomalies, things that don't go together. right? I was very lucky when I was a young man. I was on something called AIS, Applied Integrated Systems. I was an advisor to Steve Jobs, as part of a team that advised Steve Jobs. I was really young. And what was interesting was it was very wonderful watching a guy who could listen to a very linear and tight argument find the incongruity. And in the incongruity was the future. That's where the innovation was. Another thing that I'd add just very quickly is pay attention to when you're creative. And this is, Jim, where I'm a total hypocrite. I'm terrible because I'm a 2 million-mile guy in Delta Airlines. And every time I'm on an airplane, I think I'm going to write. I write hundreds of articles, and I just think I'm going to write. And I can't. And I always do it. And a man of my age should know better. So I get up. I'm supposed to be speaking in the morning somewhere. I'm at a board meeting. I get up at like 5, and I can write in the hotel room, but I can't write on the plane. But I'm so ridiculously stuck in the mud that I always try and write on the plane. I don't know why. So don't do as I'm doing, Jim. Do as I say. Pay attention to when you're creative, and so on and so forth. So the mindsets are like that.
You must have watched every darn movie that's available on the Delta, entertainment app, though. You've got to be bored enough to start writing at least.
Sleeping. That's the answer. Sleeping.
Yes, that's a good one. So, Jeff, like when you're talking about be very careful on social media, they're mostly enablers, right? They're just all patting you on the back because they're, that's why they're following you or you're following them and all of that. So that's very dangerous. When you get into, and again, this kind of before getting into the book itself on some things, are you an advocate for not only having diversity at the table, let's say, but do you try to always challenge when you're having a meeting or when you suggest that everybody's in this kind of innovation mindset? Do you have a devil's advocate? Do you champion the devil's advocate, that someone purposely trying to poke holes in what everybody's thinking?
I take it. I'm going to give you a slight variation on that. And I think it's something I do. I try and take it in a different direction. Okay. Instead of being the devil's advocate, what would it look like if it was the opposite? What if we applied it over here? How does this relate to this other thing over here? So what I try and do is, as things get too closed down, I try and offer questions that open things up. I try and open up the playbook. So it's less about trying to poke a hole in your idea, and it's more about, have we really gone that far down the road? Because this is my big issue. The problem people have, I think the biggest problem they have is getting the problem right. But the second biggest problem they have is that their idea will either be to boil the ocean and extract gold, which is completely unreasonable, or they'll turn the dial one dot, and they'll think that that's innovation. So my big thing is always right-sizing this idea and asking a lot of open questions to make sure we get the idea at the right size, so we can proof the concept, so we can see if what we believe is true or if it's utter nonsense.
So how do you overcome this problem? It is a rampant problem, actually worldwide, but we'll just say in North America, that employee engagement is really low. There's low employee engagement. There's very few people. It's like around 30% nationally, right? Across industries, that just, people just kind of are checked out in life in general, but certainly in their profession. And so if you've got low employee engagement, how before you even tell somebody these are the 6 steps, or read the creative mindset, how do you even cross this hurdle of saying that most people kind of don't care?
Yeah, it's very simple, and they shouldn't care, and nobody cares about your innovation. This is important stuff you're getting at, and it's all the reality of this. What they care about is you solving their problem. Everybody reads their own horoscope first, Jim. I mean, this is the world we live in, right?
Right.
So to me, the big issue is, instead of rah, 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 which never sticks, what you have to find out, like a Venn diagram, is what is it that you want? The good news is everybody wants something. The bad news is everybody wants something different, but you got to figure that out. What do you want, right? And then how does that meet with what we want, right? What do you want and what do we want? And how does that go together? And until you figure that out, you're never going to get engagement. And the other problem, the more interesting problem, is people who are fully engaged aren't going to do what you want because they're exhibiting self-authorizing behavior. That's the thing, the fire in the belly. That's what you want. So normally the good people are the people who do what you want, but they're not very useful, right? You know what?
Yeah.
Well, not when it comes to
Yeah.
creativity and innovation. They're useful in other things. I'm not. I don't mean to be mean about this, but I'm saying the people who exhibit self-authorizing behavior are a pain in the ass, right? I don't know how to put this, right? I know I am, right? I do things that I think are the right things to do, and the people who are effective in working with me, like they figure out how to give me something that I would want to work on that they would like done. I had one happen this morning where there's a big project that they're looking for somebody who could sort of take the project in a new direction, and they put a carrot in front of me and I'm going to bite. It's like, yeah, I'm happy to do that. I think the problem is when we try and get people to be people who they aren't, or to be motivated in a kind of a rah rah rah, way. I think
Yep.
that never works.
That's true. So true. So you do though kind of champion this thing that, look, okay, if I'm a CEO, mid-size organization, and I'm struggling against my competitor who, oh, by the way, has the exact same education, training, and experience as I do. So it's a near competitor, near peer in what it is. And I'm trying to get that little bit of difference to make me better than them. You're trying to say, just look around your own organization. Look at the people that are within the organization, because there is potential to have this untapped resource.
Absolutely. In fact, one of my mentors was C.K. Prahalad, probably the greatest innovation strategist of the 20th century, other than maybe Schumpeter, right?
Mm,
So, and the core competency, that's where that comes from. And you guys say this all the time in the military. You don't fight with the army you want, you fight with the army you have.
that's right.
So the notion is, yes, look around. It's never a capability problem. That's a cop out, right? Somebody,
Yep.
I don't have any good player. Well, maybe you're a bad coach. How do you optimize for the players that you've got?
No, I love that. And I think that should be the rallying cry to almost every senior executive, right? How are you optimizing the people that you have? How are you optimizing the resources that you have? So many people, people that listen to this podcast often, Jeff, are probably going to roll their eyes because I say this one all the time, but I'm such a believer in it. Victim or victor, right? So many people are just in this victim mentality of, I don't have the resources. I don't have the right talent. I got to go out and find it, instead of being victorious and saying, we're going to solve this. We're going to figure out ways to solve this.
You can't leave people in a reactive position, because you can have the perfect idea. They're going to judge what you're doing. Remember, innovation is a form of deviance, and society, it's a
It's
positive
true.
deviance, but it's a form of deviance. So there, people are going to judge you all the time. So when people start to judge you, say, that's a great point. What would you do? Right?
Ha.
And it calls them out. So the notion is you can't leave the world in a reactive position. You have to get momentum, and the way you're going to get momentum is what you started by saying. You have to engage. Engagement is not always sunshine and puppies.
That's right.
Engagement is we're gonna work through this.
That's awesome. So you've kind of come up with a great. So we've already talked about it. With my military background, I'm gonna kind of gyrate towards one of the things in your book. You've got an acronym.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, and I actually was very much motivated by my work with the military to make it this. So I created I created a mnemonic device. Create, CREATE, and what I did was I took 35 years of research and my work with over half the Fortune 500, right, at the senior level, and I boiled it all down into 6 skills, not
Hmm.
steps, but skills I felt that everybody needed to have. So they have to have this mindset. So there are the 8 things that go into the mindset, which again, this is my boiling it down into every person's language. But the
Right.
6 skills are clarify. That's the first one, which is what everyone gets wrong. It's the hardest one. Think about it. How many of your listeners have worked on a project for 9 months or 12 months only to find out it wasn't really the problem? This happens all the time. So the first thing is, in my classes, which the students get really mad at me, I make them spend half the semester trying to figure out what the problem is. And there's a lot of, nope, that's not it, that's not it, that's not it. And it's the questions, because if that was the problem, this would be happening. If that was the problem, that would be happening. It's obviously not the problem, right? What's the problem? So I've a great story, a very quick story around this. I worked on a project when I was very young with Apple, and it was called the Zeno Project. It was trying to teach people in South Central Los Angeles how to read, because they had very low
Hmm.
literacy rates of graduates. So this is when they had those huge laser discs. and we're teaching people how to drive a truck. And we thought, well, if they learn to drive a truck, they'll learn to read while we do this. And so all the big wigs were involved, and it turned out not only did the achievement gap didn't get smaller, it got bigger. Well, years later, I got a call from Life magazine. They wanted to talk about one of my distant relatives, a guy named Robert DeGraff, who invented paperback books. He created this company called Pocketbooks. And when I read his biography, now I didn't know the guy. My dad and his dad didn't get along, so I don't know much about that side of the family. But when I read his biography, he thought that if he made a paperback book for 25 cents, 2 bits, and put it in the train station, everybody would be literate. Now, this is an example of I thought I knew what the problem was. They didn't have technology. He thought he knew what the problem was. They didn't have sort of availability of books. It was about money. It wasn't. So the notion is we do this all the time. We solve the wrong problem. So that's the first step. Next step, replicate. Replicate is basically copying nature. It's Da Vinci. It's Buckminster Fuller. It's the huge spore when you walk into Epcot. It's called biomimicry, right? The notion is pay attention to stuff, see how they did it, and do it, apply it to your area. That was Steve Jobs' famous Stanford speech, right? The next step is elaborate. And I'll stop after this and give you a chance to comment on this before I go to the end of this. Elaborate is basically, your brain basically assimilates and accommodates information. It basically adds things to a neural net, right? And it's not left brain and right brain like Sperry thought in '83 when he won the Nobel Prize. It's really, these neurons have patterns. Otherwise, you think about it, you're driving home from the airport. It's very complicated, but you're able to work through a problem in your head. Your brain has the ability to do that, right?
Yeah.
So elaborate is just basically looking at introducing stimulus to your brain, sometimes called defamiliarization, that connects things in a different way, sometimes called bisociation, right? So these first 3 steps are simply get the problem right, copy other things, and oh, by the way, when you start brainstorming, pay attention to kind of introducing these prompts so that you actually come up with something new instead of this scatter kind of nonsense stuff that people do. And of course, under each of these skills, there's a number of methodologies that some of them your listeners will be familiar with, other ones they'll be completely unfamiliar with. But those are the first 3.
All right. So questions on each of them then. First one on Clarify. Is it in there also? When I first read about Clarify here, the first place that my head went was on communications, was to clarify it for your people and for what is the issue and all that stuff. Where does communications come in here? Because are you talking about this is the mindset that as a skill that is just for the individual, but from an organizational perspective, is communicating the right clarification, I guess, or the same kind of thing in there?
It's related. It's a yes, yes, yes answer. So think of communication as the top layer, and the lower layer is what are we really solving? So how many times have you been in a meeting, Jim, where everybody said, oh, we're really on the same page. We have a shared vision. And you start digging in and you realize 2 minutes in, none of you are on the same page.
They don't even know what
you
you're
have
talking
no
about.
shared vision, right? The communication was all to obscure the real issue that nobody wants to handle here.
I love it. And then you're not shy about it at all. If someone has done it right. So there's kind of this thinking about best practices, and maybe that's a bad term. But you're not shy about saying if someone did get a certain thing right, there's no reason not to repeat that.
Well, one of my favorite examples is the Mayo Clinic, which had low patient satisfaction scores. So they tried all these change things. It didn't work. They took the doctors and they put them up in the Rochester Ritz-Carlton for 2 weeks, right? Then they put them back in the Mayo Clinic and made them live in a bed for 2 weeks in the Mayo Clinic. Well, you can imagine all of a sudden some things became clear. They all of a sudden had some ideas about, why people didn't like being in the bed. And of course, now the patient satisfaction at the Mayo Clinic is one of the best in the world.
That's genius, by the way. That is genius. And then elaborate, like, is it really just to put a bunch of teasers out there to put some, to make sure that everybody understands it? It's teeing up the subject. It's making sure, is it kind of like the traditional whiteboarding, brainstorming kind of things where you've got it all out there?
No, it's more structured than that, but certainly we're trying to get into a flow state here. You're right about that. And we have to, I call them the 4 F's: fluency. We more ideas are better than few. Flow states. The notion is even if it's a bad idea, people adjust it. Freedom, right? We go through the whole thing, what we know about brainstorming. But basically, the problem with brainstorming is that it's scattered. And what you really want to do is be more structured in how you introduce
Beautiful.
ideas, so that even though we're getting an abundance of ideas, at least what we're doing is creating points of departure from the traditional idea that we've got.
Ha. Okay, got it. Boom. First three in the bucket. Got it.
Okay, so then there's associate, which is my favorite. I am absolutely what's sometimes called adaptive reasoning, using metaphors, analogies. Your brain makes connections in complicated ways, and when you turn back the inside out, you also see what's missing. So I've worked on a number of really well known projects, but one I worked on was Eco Imagination at General Electric, their $15 billion spend. And one of the interesting things that they picked when we were going through, what this thing would look like, is you picked NASCAR, and it was hilarious because I don't know much about NASCAR. I'm a huge sports fan. I'm just not a NASCAR fan.
Got it.
So they're taking me through. This is the race driver in the what we're coming up with. This is the fuel. Now remember, the problem when you brainstorm is ideas don't hold together as solutions, and adaptive reasoning holds them together, and analogical thinking holds them together. So, but because I'm not familiar enough with NASCAR, I said, well, what's this other thing? What's the fan in the stand?
Ha.
What constitutes a lap? So then they'd had to turn it back around, and they had to invent things that made that metaphor work. So metaphors are powerful ways and analogies of making very large jumps from what we currently think to other things. Now, there's a lot written about this, because if you get the metaphors wrong, you can really go quickly down the
Oh, wow.
primrose path. There's a couple of Harvard researchers named Zaltman and Zaltman. It's a father-son team. They sound like a law firm,
Yeah, they
but
do.
they write a lot about this, right? And it's a good point. A lot of times, companies get the wrong metaphor, right? So then there's translate, which and I know is basically storytelling. And boy, was Steve Jobs! I got a good front row seat for that. Um, and making a story. So what's kind of happening in these skills, I call this translate, is very complicated. There's morphologies in here where there's attributes and functions and characters, and how do they go together. And if you've ever heard, your 4-year-old try and tell you a story, or your great aunt try and tell you a dirty joke, you know how hard this is, right? your brain your brain your brain has to go a long way to do this. And then finally, evaluate, which is simply, don't leave the $1 billion idea on the board. You got to pick the $1 billion idea, and then you got to create a pathway to it. Don't think you're going to get on the green with one shot. You're not Tiger Wood or Jack Nicklaus or whoever you believe is a great golfer. You got to
Right.
stay on the fairway.
Stay on the fairway.
Just see what you can do. So those are the last three: ATE. So CREATE.
Gosh, I tell you, again, it's so funny sometimes when you have these things and they're just put singularly, you could say, oh, that makes sense, right? Of course, or, yep, I think those ways too. But it's when you put them together, I love that you say these are skills, not necessarily steps, like how you've got to master all these. Your metaphor one for associate is amazing to me, because I will tell you, I've seen that done millions of times where somebody just says this crazy metaphor and it actually doesn't relate. It's wrong. And that sticks in my head, Jeff, more than anything else. And I never realized there's research into that. I mean, it makes sense, right? It's one of these ahas, like, yep, that's.
Let me give you my favorite one. I've been an advisor for years to the Federal Reserve. When somebody says, all we really need to do is balance our bank account, I just want to go ballistic. It's a terrible metaphor. If you have money, you want to invest it. You want to get more out of your money. You don't want to balance your checkbook. But it sticks. It sticks.
Yeah.
And so it's very hard to get it out of people's heads saying that's the worst thing you could do. There are even biblical parables about, the servant who buried the money. I mean, it's a bad idea.
It's so true. It's so true. And I love too about how when you talk about, I'm a huge believer in translate and storytelling. I believe storytelling goes all the way back to the primal humans that we are. I mean, we told stories on the cave walls. And I just think that storytelling really is a powerful thing that's often overlooked. And it's not really brought up as a leadership competency to be a great storyteller, but boy, does that work.
I have to tell you, years ago, I had Bob McKee, the famous screenwriting professor at UCLA, old Michigan graduate, come in and talk to my MBAs on their first day. And the reaction was really interesting. I would say a third of the students loved them, and a third of the students just hated him. And it was the most interesting response because the guy was saying, your ideas, if you can't communicate them effectively, are worthless, right?
Yep.
And of course, people think there's sort of a moral issue to that, and there might be, but his point was very well taken, which is, if the tree falls in the forest and no one hears it, it doesn't matter.
That's right. So true. It's so true. And I in one of my earlier podcasts, I had a futurist on, and he was like, I don't have a crystal ball, but I can sort of control the future by owning the narrative. If I own the narrative, if I create the story to how the future will be, it now paints that future for us. And more than likely, we will kind of drive towards that.
It's so funny. I just wrote an article. I'm one of the original LinkedIn influencers. I just wrote this little short piece about Star Trek. And I was saying, I grew up in the age of Star Trek, so Spock's tricorder becomes, your iPad, and, Uhura's, earpiece is your Bluetooth bud, and the view screen is your large right? But the notion is, how much of the future did we create, or how much was it a self-fulfilling prophecy from people like me watching Star Trek? So I absolutely think this is so true. Your futurist friend, whoever owns the narrative owns the future.
That's right. That's right. Well, I will tell you, we'll leave it with this for evaluate as the last part of create. I believe my evaluation of this podcast is that it's going to be one of my most popular ones. That's what I believe, Jeff. That's for sure.
Let me just say a couple things before we get off here. One, I wrote the book for the democratization of innovation. It's written for everybody. Two, if you go to my website, jeffdegraff.com, no one will ever bother you. There are 15 videos, all the slides, a syllabus, everything. So if you want to do this, no one will bother you. This is for you, right? This is so you can make your life a little better. This is for your church group. This is for what you're doing online now that we're in the middle of COVID. This is what you do with your business. So I wrote this to give those resources to people who are out there trying to make their life better and new.
And Jeff, we will 100% include all those links on the show notes. It's one of my favorite things to do is to make sure that you and I huddle, before or after the show and say, for our listeners spending the time with us here today, how can we kind of thank them back? And all that stuff's in the show notes because, and someone like you, I love the fact to where you're like, hey, a lot of my thoughts, it's not protected IP. I want to get up and, like what we were talking about before, you're kind of preaching it from the highest mountain about going out there. And Jeff, I tell you, you have taught us today that innovation is every day and it's everywhere. I can't thank you enough for the time that you've spent for us. And I know that we're all going to enjoy the book, The Creative Mindset. It's already been out. It came out in September. It's doing great. And I know that every one of our last listeners on here are going to gobble that up. And you were the right person for this show. So thanks again, Jeff, for your time.
Jim, thanks for having me on. This was great.
Awesome. Take care. Thanks for joining our leadership movement this week. Listening to Jeff teaching everyone to innovate every day, everywhere was just inspiring and has motivated me to rethink how I will approach so many different leadership challenges. Thanks again, Jeff. Fantastic podcast. Don't forget our show notes are posted on the website with key leader takeaways, and be sure to subscribe to the podcast and tell a friend so we can continue to build the tribe. Until next time, remember that iron sharpens iron. Make yourself and others around you better every single day.